Okay, so I have been told by my colleagues that we are online now. So thanks to all of our guests today for joining us. Welcome to European Values Talk number 2. Today we will be talking about Russian and Chinese governments using disinformation and geopolitical power play to manipulate the pandemic we are all in. We have 4 distinguished guests today, starting with Jakub Kalenský, who is a senior fellow from the Atlantic Council. Then we have Charles Burton, who is senior fellow at Mcdonald Laurier Institute in Canada, and also senior non-resident fellow with us at European Value Center for Security Policy in Prague. Then we have sitting in Tbilisi, Mariam Tsitsikashvili. She's a research fellow at GRAS, Georgian Reform Associates, our proud partner in Tbilisi, and she also serves as a non-resident fellow at European Value Center for Security Policy. And the last but not least is our great friend Edward Lucas, sitting in London, who is a vice president of CEPA, a great partner of ours as well. So thanks, guys, for joining us. And I will just remind our viewers that if they want to ask questions to our panelists, and if you are seeing this, if you are watching this stream on YouTube, if you see on the YouTube panel, just below it, you see the first link to Slido, and then you can post your questions. I'll be getting the questions and asking our panelists here. So I will just briefly start with Jakub Kalenský out of Atlantic Council. Jakub, could you tell us over what do you see Russia, the Russian government and Russian proxies doing in this pandemic?
Hi, and thanks for having me here. Good afternoon to everyone. Russia is doing pretty much what the Soviet KGB used to be doing already back in 50s and 60s and 70s. They are using any similar situation, be it a new virus or a new chemical or biological weapon, to accuse the United States of creating this weapon to eradicate some part of the population. They were spreading that it's used to eradicate Chinese. It is actually very similar to what the KGB was spreading about AIDS back in 80s. They were accusing the CIA of creating the virus, human immunodeficiency virus, to exterminate the black population of the United States. Now we see a reverberation of exactly the same method right now. It is something that the KGB used to be doing already back in 50s during the Korean War. Here in this part of Europe, we know the famous stories about the Colorado beetles being dropped on these socialist fields to destroy the crop of our workers. So Russia is using this crisis to undermine the United States, to accuse them of creating the virus, creating the pandemic. The second level of the Russia's disinformation campaign, which is still a bit more external rather than internal, is to use it to undermine the European Union. So to messages that the European Union fails to respond, that this crisis means the end of the European Union. Schengen isn't working, borders are closing, which means that the European project has completely failed. I think these are the main two narratives that you would see being spread outside. Inside Russia, the disinformation campaign seems to use this pandemic to highlight again how Russia is superior to all the other nations. Every other country is falling apart, and only we here in Russia are handling the crisis well. So these are the main messages I see in the information space, and I will be happy to elaborate on anything needed.
Thank you, Jakub. We'll get back to you with additional questions. Let's jump right to Charles. So Charles, you are sitting in Ottawa, but you are following very closely what the Chinese government does. So could you tell us what you see happening?
Well, I think certainly with regard to this new coronavirus, the Chinese government has mismanaged the information badly. So, as is characteristic of of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee Propaganda Department. They don't issue accurate statistics or accurate narrative on anything. It's filtered through their perception of how to best legitimate the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party domestically and abroad. So we know in this case that initially, when it first became apparent in Wuhan that there was a new form of SARS spreading, that the local officials, out of fear that they would be criticized for allowing such a thing to occur in China, suppressed the information and subsequently suppressed the fact that there was community transfer of the disease. And so this then led to, a much more serious situation than there might have been if there'd been more transparency in the information being issued. I think that this has affected the Chinese Communist Party rule domestically because people in China are aware that the Chinese Communist Party does not issue information which is scientifically valid, and that is the reason why there's been so much suffering in China as a result. Secondly, nobody, either I think in China and I hope abroad, trusts any of the subsequent statistics that the Chinese Communist Party has issued. And so while the party is trying to get the economy moving again, people are reluctant to come out of their homes and go back to work because they're afraid that the virus is much more active than the official propaganda depicts. So we have this problem, and I think that after this is all over, the fact of China's misinformation domestically, misinforming the WHO, which has then affected how particularly Canada has responded to this crisis initially, will come back in terms of our ability to trust China in other aspects, such as Huawei. If I could just talk a bit about the subsequent response by the government after the misinformation was issued and became apparent. In the initial phase, Party General Secretary Xi Jinping went to ground and tried to transfer the responsibility for this crisis to the Premier of the State Council, Li Keqiang, his rival. But then they reversed it and decided to make the most of a bad situation by not only claiming that the Chinese Communist Party's response to the crisis was disastrous, but that in fact it affirmed the Chinese system is superior to that of the Western liberal democracies, and that the Chinese Communist Party has used this to achieve a victory on behalf of Xi Jinping. So we have the statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zhao Lijian, on March the 5th, that says, China's signature strength, efficiency, and speed in this fight has been widely acclaimed. China has set a new standard for global efforts against the epidemic. Then they've issued a book, Battle Against the Epidemic in Multiple Languages, which is about President Xi Jinping's outstanding leadership in the fight against the novel crisis. The General Secretary has been called Commander of the People's War against COVID-19. And so it's been reframed to make the Chinese Communist Party's response to the coronavirus a triumph and a vindication of Xi Jinping's initiatives to strengthen party control over all aspects of life. So, they've been able to use very sophisticated control and management techniques, including tracking every citizen by requiring downloading of a special app that allows the government to know all your contacts and where you've been and what you're doing and what you're saying to give you a rating as to how dangerous you are. One assumes that this new attempt to control China domestically will be continued after the virus is over. In terms of the ideological strife, the Xinhua News Agency, in their feature article, China Acts Responsibly in Global Fight Against Coronavirus, says, through the epidemic, the international community gets a deeper understanding of China's efforts to safeguard the well-being of mankind. And so we shouldn't be upset about the Chinese government's mismanagement of the virus or the fact that they were not controlling the incubator for viruses in the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. but that we should be grateful that we've been safeguarded, our well-being has been safeguarded by the wise leadership of Xi Jinping, as opposed to, other countries. It says, the Global Times says, the Chinese method is the only method that's proved successful. China has acted as a responsible big country. Nonetheless, due to ideological and political prejudice against China, American elites don't believe China's moves and experience are reliable and helpful. Then another one, U.S. political system stymies effective virus response. They make a similar claim. And then, of course, as we know, the Chinese government has been favoring certain countries with donations of protective gear, like testing kits and so on. And Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, has promised to give 500,000 kits for coronavirus testing, 1 million face masks to United States, Europe, Iran, and Africa. And then we had, after this further, we had the first example since, as Jakub pointed out, since the Korean War, of a systematized Russian-style confusing disinformation campaign, drawing on information from Canada. The Foreign Ministry spokesman, Jolly Jen, in his Twitter feed, 286,000 followers, said it might be the US Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan. Be transparent, make public your data. US owe us an explanation. So, it's come, I think it's also possibly come from Italy once the US explanation was not fully taken. But the point is, it's confusion. And so they take up an article written by a Russian sympathetic Montreal Center for Research on Globalization, a site founded by Mikhail Chossudovsky, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, who runs this think tank out of Montreal that the Soviets have been using to affirm that, foreigners find the Kremlin an excellent political agency. And I can give you a brief summary of all of the confusion. On the Chinese TV, they issued on their website an article that divides 10 parts of conspiracy speculation on the theory that the US brought the novel coronavirus to Wuhan. And they said some major US media and politicians made groundless claims that the novel coronavirus originates in China, blamed and slandered China, even asking for an apology from China. Then it says, why did the US withdraw from the 1972 Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention in 2001? Why did it try to prevent a monitoring mechanism for the execution of the convention? Is it standing in the way of developing biological weapons for the United States? So maybe the coronavirus is, a plan by the United States to make us all sick for hard knows what reason. If not, why are there new biological laboratories in Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan? Are those labs for biological warfare? Is it possible that they are keeping viruses as pets? You might comment on that, Mariam.
Right.
And then they say it's foreign meddling. Then they claim that the U.S. troops who came to the October 2019 military games brought the virus, and want to know why none of those people have been tested. Subsequently, the U.S. complained to the Chinese ambassador, Tsui Tiankai, in Washington about this nonsense. He then disavows it. But the spokesman, the foreign ministry spokesman, continues to allow for this kind of confusion. Finally, the Chinese government's Twitter feed, Twitter not being available in China, but, extensive and increasing use of it, particularly since October of last year, make a conclusion. And the tweet that came out last week says, different voices among Chinese diplomats, Ambassador Tsui Tiankai and Jolly Jen, mirror China's diversified discourse system and a democratic decision-making system. So basically, not only was the virus developed in the United States to sicken the world on purpose, but that the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party affirms the superiority of the Chinese system, and it turns out that it's democratic. So the disinformation is quite extensive. To what extent it's being picked up by people is hard to say, but the proliferation of Chinese government-associated Twitter accounts is now in the hundreds as opposed to in the tens last fall. So there's clearly a full court press to try and apply this sort of disinformation. Whether we'll be seeing more of the kind of Russian, confusion disinformation campaign from China in the years ongoing, it's hard to say, but I think it's indicative that the Chinese government is panicked about what's happened and concerned about how it's going to impact on their international role and the prestige of the regime domestically. So that's how I see it.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thanks for all the details and explanations, which I think will be interesting to discuss later on as well. So before we go to Mariam, I just want to remind our viewers that if you want to post questions to our speakers, please go to Slido. You can find the link on our website, europeanvalues.net, or you can go to our YouTube channel where you probably are looking into this, where you are following this, and you could find a link to Slido just below the video of this stream. So Mariam, if I might go to you, so you are sitting in Tbilisi and following what Russia and China are doing towards Georgia, but towards the Caucasus in general as well. So what are you actually seeing?
Thanks, Jakub. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about these very, very sensitive issues. But before I begin, let me say whatever my colleagues have already touched upon is really familiar to us. We have witnessed everything in Georgia. I think it's not only Russia that has been always using Georgia as a test ground, but maybe China also started to do that, because the disinformation examples that our colleague has presented is really, really present in case of Georgia also. And before I go into details, I would like to also mention that obviously the fake news and disinformation spread more easily in Georgia, because up until now we managed to contain the virus, and we do have like 148 confirmed coronavirus cases after almost a month since we had very first case tested and confirmed. So definitely our adversaries are using their resources to disseminate disinformation more and more. It was not a surprise to see in Georgia as well as in the Caucasus to see Kremlin exploiting the newly emerged crisis that is connected to coronavirus. And obviously, the panic and this frightened people definitely are more vulnerable to disinformation. And the adversaries like Russia do know it best, and they took the moment. And of course, as soon as we had the first confirmed case in Georgia, they started spreading disinformation. It may be, in a way, good news, but the Luger Lab and related disinformation is not hunting people's minds that much anymore in Georgia. Because since we had the very first case confirmed in Georgia, it has been the Luger Lab where the tests are made. And, everybody in one night, those who previously may have believed that the disinformation that was spread regarding Luger Lab, it has been the laboratory for experimenting on people or producing biological weapons. Now they already see that it is the Luger Lab that helped Georgia to cope with the virus.
Could you, Mariam, please, can I stop you for a second? Could you just give us a brief introduction of what the disinformation on this lab is? Because I think it is not very well known to everybody who doesn't follow Georgia or the Caucasus. But please just give us a brief intro what the mainly Russian disinformation about it has been.
Yeah, this Luger laboratory that studies the diseases and epidemics in the country was constructed and became operational with the help of the United States, and it's working since 2013. And since this lab became operational, we've been seeing disinformation, I mean regular and consistent one, that blamed the laboratory in spreading different viruses, different epidemics, not only in Georgia, but also in Russia. This laboratory was blamed for spreading Ebola virus, Zika virus, then we had last year swine flu, and there also these pro-Russian disinformers also blamed this lab in spreading this swine flu. But it was also last year that this kind of a propaganda did not hide itself beyond the different media agencies, but Maria Zakharova, so foreign affairs representative of the Russian Federation, as well as Igor Kirillov, who represents the Defense Ministry of Russia, they directly said that this lab is used for producing biological weapons in Georgia. And of course, some people, including in Georgia, did have some, misbeliefs and misinterpretations regarding this lab, because this disinformation has been consistent over these years. But the only, so to say, advantage or plus that we have this from this coronavirus outbreak is that this lab proved to be the only center, especially in the beginning, it was the only center where the tests were made. So people started praying for this center instead of, having these misbeliefs and misconceptions about the lab. However, in other direction, let me say, pro-Russian outlets and fringe groups and those who previously were in the front of spreading disinformation, and especially the anti-Western and pro-Russian disinformation, they also tried to exploit this coronavirus outbreak to their interests. Everything that Jakub Kalenský mentioned was also done in Georgia. Over these years, a Russian strategic goal is to show that the West is weak, that the West is not delivering, and in that sense, Georgia should say no to its Western aspirations. In this case, with the awful epidemic in Italy or in other European states, of course, Russian disinformation says that this is the clear result that the West is weak, that they cannot cope and deal with the virus well. And of course, they are pushing this narrative that if the European Union member states are not helping Italy and cannot help their health systems to deal with the virus, how can they help us? How can they help Georgians, for example? But this was not really surprising to see Russia doing this type of disinformation and using coronavirus for discrediting the Western institutions. It was not also a surprise for us to see that they, of course, blamed United States as well as other Western countries for spreading the virus. But it was quite a surprise to me to see that those pro-Kremlin outlets and pro-Kremlin groups are doing their best to amplify not only Kremlin narratives, but also those that are spread by China. So what I was listening to just from our colleague, the pro-Kremlin outlets are trying to push this narrative that it is the China that is helping the West. It is the China that has helped Georgia because they granted Georgia with 1,000 fast tests for the diagnosing of coronavirus. So it is quite a big amount of disinformation that tries to glorify China for two reasons. First, that it showed that it was effective against the virus, that it already defeated the virus, and secondly, those pro-Kremlin outlets do also glorify China for doing generous things, for being kind enough to help European states, while the European Union member countries are not helping each other. So that is more or less the first thought that I wanted to share with you.
Looks like we lost Jakub.
Hello,
Yeah.
Jakub. Jakub?
Okay.
Oh, there he is.
Sorry, my call just got cut out for a second. So thank you very much, Mariam, and let's go to Edward. So Edward, if you could comment on what you have heard and what you didn't hear and you would like to add, please.
Well, thanks very much, Jakub, for having me on this great panel. It's a pleasure. We don't get to see each other face to face these days, so we meet on these video calls, and it's a pleasure. I think that there's one big thing that I want to highlight, which is that we are seeing that there's no such thing as a pure information operation. A lot of the focus over the last few years has been on what people have called fake news, disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, so on. And I've always been a bit nervous about that, because that may be the bit of the operation that you can see. It's not necessarily the bit of the operation that really matters. And I think that one of the big points we see now is that the information dimension of these information of these influence operations, of these active measures, fits with things that are happening in the real world. So we have in Italy a very clear example where you have a propaganda barrage about which is the West isn't helping, the EU is failing, and so on. Then you have a very strong kinetic military side of real soldiers with real staff turning up in real trucks and driving all over, driving around Italy, going to Bergamo. You have influence networks being activated in Italian politics to make the most of this and to enable it to happen, and then a sort of a diplomatic vector as well, saying, well, wouldn't it be great now if Italy would support the lifting of sanctions against Russia? So we see all these different elements combining, and I think that's quite an important takeaway. The second thing, which I think is really new, which has been touched on, is we've seen a complete change in the Chinese approach. And I'm not a China specialist, but I've noticed, particularly in the 17+1 countries, that the Chinese approach has been pretty disciplined. It's a matter of pushing back against things they don't like, Tibet, Taiwan, these things, promoting the idea of China as a stable and lucrative economic partner and as a responsible global player. And this blizzard of disinformation is absolutely new as far as I can see. It's very similar to what the Russians did over Salisbury, when they came out with lots and lots of different conspiracy theories about what really happened with the Skripals, that they hadn't been poisoned, or they had been poisoned but it was MI6, or they'd been kidnapped, or that this was a British bioweapon or chemical weapon experiment that went wrong, but all this sort of crazy contradictory stuff. And that seems to me it has now been, that playbook's been picked up by the Chinese, and that's new. And to an extent, I think it may be a mistake, because Russia has always positioned itself a bit as a rogue state. You know, the rules don't apply to us. We don't see any benefit from playing along with the way the world works. We're quite happy to do these very sort of transgressive rogue things. And certainly in the part of the world that I look at, China has tried to be much more responsible. And although these conspiracy theories have been quite successful in confusing the public to some extent, I wonder whether there may be a bit of long-term reputational damage to China from having pushed this crazy stuff out, and we might want to discuss that. The other thing which I noticed, and this is my final point, is that the Kremlin is making quite a sophisticated point, along with all the crazy ones. I just wanted to read you a interesting thing which I saw on the Valdai Club website. So I'm hearing a phone going, but maybe I hope that's not me. And this is from a piece by a well-known Russian foreign affairs analyst called Elena Alexeyenkova. And she says, the coronavirus has confirmed what the world has been afraid to admit for several years. There are no global responses to global challenges. And she continues, she finishes the piece, that's the opening line in her piece. And the last one is perhaps even more interesting. She says, no wonder some people in Europe are already comparing the pandemic to World War II. And this probably means that Europe will need a second Yalta and new agreements on how to organize the afterlife once the pandemic is over. And leaving aside all the crazy stuff and the conspiracy theories and the exaggerations, I think that encapsulates the way Russia sees this. They want this to be the final failure of the global order and a return to a national governments operating under national discretion. So just as you take your own stance on epidemiology, you also take your own stance on civil liberties, and Hungary does its thing and other countries do their thing. And that will be a world that's really well suited to the way Russia wants to behave. This is the death knell of the multilateral order. Now, I think they're overstating this. I think our multilateral institutions have been slow. There's no doubt about that. Both the EU and NATO and the G7, G20, none of them have, they all get a kind of B or C grade for their response so far. But I think now they're getting into gear, and that will be the results over the next few weeks may be different from what we've seen from the previous three. But let's not be in any doubt. That's the thing for Russia. They want the global response to fail. I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Edward. So I would like now to open the questions, and I guess that I would like you to respond to each other. I think the big thing here with what might be really new is how China uses the Russian disinformation playbook, which Charles, Jakub, Edward, and Mariam, all of you basically touch upon as well. So and that touches on several questions which came to us by Slido. So if there are more questions coming through Slido, please send them in, dear viewers, so we could actually ask them here at the panel. So if some of you want to answer that, or comment on how you see it, Jakub Kalenský, go on, please. Go ahead.
I think Edward highlighted a really important point, and the advantage of actually being just on an online event is that you can Google an article very quickly. So I found this piece from War on the Rocks from this January, where Jean-Baptiste Jean-Vermeer, whom we all know, and his co-author Paul Charon were actually writing exactly about that it's happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan, at least in the past 18 months, 12 to 18 months, such a Russification of the Chinese operations, that it used to be very much like the Russian propaganda before 2008. Those who follow the Russian information operations for some time, if you follow the interviews with Margarita Simonian, she actually highlighted the war in Georgia as a turning point. Back then, we realized it's not only about spreading how Russia is great, but we also realized we have to attack the opponent. We have to say how bad the West is, how incompetent they are, etc. And suddenly we see that China has become very much like that in the past 6, 12, 18 months. Maybe Charles will know more exactly. And they were highlighting I believe it was quarter a year ago, January. They were highlighting these operations already in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. However, more recent cases show that Chinese trolls changed their behavior and became more aggressive. In the cases of Taiwan and Hong Kong, mainland China has been resorting to negative messaging and Russian-like techniques. There was nothing familiar about the playbook: cross-platform coordinated networks of fake and automated accounts, amplifying messages designed to mobilize online audiences and drive offline effects. We see that what China tried in their sphere of influence, as they would probably call it, and then they exported it to Europe. Precisely what Russia is doing, first internally within the Russian information ecosystem, then they try it in Ukraine, in Georgia, maybe in the Baltic states, and later they exported to further audiences. I think this very much shows us how crucial it is to finally become a bit more robust in the response to these information operations, because what we see is that not only the aggressors are becoming more aggressive because they see that we don't defend ourselves, but it's the same case as if you would stop punishing murders, you would suddenly have more murderers. So we are not punishing one information criminal. Obviously, we have more information criminals appearing. It's only a logical consequence of us being so weak and irresponsible in the reaction to the Russian information operations. And China is obviously a much more threatening actor with their financial resources, with their AI advantage. So I generally hope that this will become a wake-up call for the more civilized world, that we can't let this happening just without consequences.
Right. Before I give the word to Charles, there is also a related question to this, which says, what should the government communicators do when they essentially see Russia and China doing a very similar disinformation tactics? Because that's on minds of many of our friends and colleagues in governments in democratic countries. So how should they react, you think? So Charles, if you can go ahead, please.
Well, I think that, we have indications from statement from the Canadian Prime Minister, who, has had a reputation of being sympathetic to the Chinese regime, as well as his father, our former Prime Minister, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. Justin Trudeau is, been speaking favorably about China. And I think that in Canada, I think the Chinese previous argument was that the Chinese regime behaves in ways which are inconsistent with Western values because the Chinese regime is the inheritor of China's great Confucian cultural tradition. And so what it amounts to essentially is, if we criticize China's violations of the universal norms of human rights, or China's violations of the trade agreements that they've made, we're engaging in, culturally racist kind of approach to China. Now, what's happened with this Russian-style disinformation is that it's becoming apparent that the Chinese regime is not culturally distinct, but like the Russians, panicky, manipulative, dealing in false information. And so I think that when this crisis is over, there will be a reevaluation of how we relate to China and if the West can trust the Chinese regime. And this would have an impact on, of course, the Huawei decision, which is still somewhat up in the air in two of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing consortium countries, Britain and particularly Canada, that hasn't made any decision. I think it's unlikely after this is all over that we will see any country that will be able to make any kind of agreement with China based on good faith. So Huawei, not likely, free trade agreements and further commitments to China, not likely. And because of China's evident manipulation of the WHO and, evidence that the Chinese regime is attempting to undermine multilateral institutions by placing agents of the regime in key positions, that we will be increasingly skeptical of China as a participant in the decisions of the global community. And so I think that this disinformation and the way that China has attempted to defend itself over the coronavirus will have a long-term impact in terms of China's relations with the West. The West will have no choice but to respond in a way that I think many of us, associated with European values, have been urging, because the bankruptcy of the basis of the legitimacy of the Chinese regime is becoming more and more apparent as China stumbled more and more badly in their information campaign and a very explicit use of false information, false statistics, and false narratives to try and achieve some sort of advantage from the crisis.
Right. May I follow up on that, Charles? We also have a related question, which I want to pose directly to you. The question says, there is a disconnect between one situation where Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson and the Chinese ambassador to the United States walked back on some of the
I think I know what he wants to ask, and this is the conflict between the China Foreign Ministry
relation to the context.
Yeah, I missed most of your question, but I think I know what it is anyway. So you have the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman who has made these absurd allegations that the coronavirus originated in the United States, or there was a secondary one which picked up on something and distorted something. An Italian scholar had said that it might have originated in Italy. And then Cui Tiankai, the Chinese ambassador to Washington, suggested that what the Chinese foreign ministry spokesman was saying is a false narrative. So then as people who watch China, our immediate thought was, oh my God, there's a split in the senior levels of the leadership, and this matter is being used for political factional dispute. But I think that I'm more inclined to go along with what Ed is saying, is that this confusion is part of the strategy. That China will suggest it's the United States and suggest it's not the United States at the same time. So that when you have multiple narratives going on, the true narrative, which is the one about alleging that the global crisis could be attributed to Chinese state mismanagement of the coronavirus over the first 3 weeks of their being aware of it, becomes just one narrative of many narratives. And from that point of view, not necessarily the correct one. So we're not seeing at least there's no evidence to us that there's any use of this coronavirus to further the factional interests of, say, a more enlightened element within China, or to try and displace Xi Jinping as the party general secretary. But certainly, when it's all over, I think Chinese people will feel a degree of dissatisfaction with their government because, like us, they're aware that this thing is related to political mismanagement and indicates the shortcomings of the Chinese one-party authoritarian system based on party control of information through the Communist Party Central Committee Department of Propaganda. Mm-hmm. So I think that remains to be seen. But I think the idea of the foreign ministry spokesman and the ambassador in Washington giving different messaging actually serves the overall Russian-style strategy of trying to confuse the issue, to take the focus of responsibility away from the leadership of the party.
Right. I have a related question to Mariam, Jakub, and Edward. Basically, two parts of one question. First, which Western organizations or institutions you would say are doing good job in responding to Russian and Chinese disinformation now? If there are any examples of who you think is at least doing something right. And related question is, what should social media platforms actually be doing right now? I know it's a very broad question, but I guess it's good to kind of start answering that. So who wants to start?
Maybe I will start because I had some comments to make even before the question. First of all, regarding the Chinese and Russian narratives, I would like to point out that there is, of course, there are many conspiracies, many exaggerations, false health advice and recommendations that make, the work of our healthcare specialists as well as the authorities really hard. They pose immediate threats sometimes, the disinformations that, for example, include false health advice and so on, that are also spread by Russian disinformation actors in Georgia. But the biggest threat so far, what I see and what can pose a long-term threat for countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, or others, I mean newly independent countries, is that Russia and China have been quite successfully so far promoting the idea that it is the authoritarian regimes who are capable of containing the crisis of these, like the coronavirus crisis. So the countries who do not have democratic experience, I mean, like Georgia and Ukraine, the public is definitely more susceptible to the disinformation of this kind. And therefore, to go first back to the question that you asked, Jakub, regarding the local governments, I mean, the government of Georgia or other authorities, what to do about these Chinese and Russian actors promoting such divisive and dangerous narratives. I wouldn't go far. I will just say that in case of Georgian government, they just need to say to the public. And we do not see saying this. In contrast to that, I mean, the recently, since some mainstream media included some media who is critical to the current government, obviously made some reporting mistakes, but they were definitely reporting mistakes, and they are not, run by the either Russians or Chinese. But the government was really quick to respond to the TV media outlet that is critical towards them, but they are so silent when the Russian TV outlets are spreading disinformation. So the very first advice and recommendations, what they should do, they should recognize this threat and they should communicate it to the audience. Regarding the new questions that we have about the institutions who are working well on coronavirus disinformation and so on, definitely it is not Facebook, I guess. And I will try to respond to the second part of the question. What should they do? They have quite big capacity and resources to reduce the amount of disinformation that is spread worldwide. That is spread including in Georgia, and for now the biggest amplifying tool and amplifying platform that those groups are using, it is the Facebook. So concretely what we need from Facebook is to give researchers, for example, greater access to the information that has been shrinking and limiting over these years. Secondly, we need to really reduce the amount of the fake news and disinformation that is labeled by fact checkers as fake news and disinformation, that may be working, that maybe is working in some other countries, but countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, those instruments are not working in Georgia. And this is kind of a, I don't know, racist that Facebook is having, that they care about US citizens and try to reduce the disinformation for them, but they do not care countries like Georgia or others. Mm. And thirdly, also, it concerns to the coronavirus, and it concerns to other types of disinformation that we had. We definitely need more transparency of pages. We definitely need more transparency of advertising, and we need to know who is targeting us and why.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Edward or Jakub, who wants to start? And thank you, Mariam. Jakub, okay, go ahead.
I believe Edward has raised his hand earlier, so let's.
Sorry. Okay, Edward, London first.
Okay, I just wanted to pick up a bit on what Charles said, that I think that a lot of what Putin has done over the past 15 years has been what you might call tactically smart but strategically stupid, jumping in, exploiting the opportunities that are presented by different events, intimidating countries and individuals, and these sort of series of stunts. And they're often quite successful in the short term. So, murder Alexander Litvinenko, for example, or intimidate Sweden by highlighting its air defense weaknesses. And that pays an immediate political dividend. It can go down quite well at home. But in the long run, it's bad because it raises awareness, starts creating coalitions of resistance. And I wonder whether what China, I used to think that China was being strategically quite smart, and I would be interested to know whether this is now they're making the Russian mistake. On what the platforms, there was a question about who's doing things right, and there's a not very well known organization called the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Center, which is a kind of NATO plus coordination center for moving humanitarian aid around in crises, and it's actually been doing quite a good job, and it puts military heavy lift abilities, particularly on aviation, connects them up with disaster relief and humanitarian aid efforts, and it's been moving quantities of medical supplies around Europe, not getting perhaps as much attention as it should do. I suggest they should get onto social media and start following some of the Russian examples of how to get themselves noticed. So I think that's one thing. And just today, the NATO foreign ministers meeting virtually tasked the SACER with getting more NATO heavy lift abilities, capabilities behind moving stuff around. And the final point was about the platforms. And I think one thing that Facebook should do instantly is to put a button on Facebook feeds where you can say, is this I think this is disinformation. I'd like to report it as particularly a kind of coronavirus related fakery or hoaxes or scare stories. You have already this kind of the general report button, but I think that we need to get much better at identifying these hoaxes and scare stories and misinformation when they're just knocking around on Facebook, often before they've got onto Twitter, where we can see them more easily. And I think that Facebook, with its resources, should be really in the lead there. There's also a very good organization called NewsGuard, which I've written about, which gives a kind of green tick to reputable sources, which means organizations that have a street address, named editorial staff, codes of practice, published corrections and clarifications, and so on. So I think we need to, the platforms could do much more to highlight whether the stuff you're looking at is coming from reputable sources or not. I also think WhatsApp could start putting that. They don't have to break the encryption on WhatsApp, but you could have a button that would be there on your WhatsApp page saying, "Is this disinformation?" That you could click and to search what you're looking at. So I give the platforms pretty low marks, except on one thing, which is on the search algorithms, and it's really because I'm interested in disinformation. I'm trying to look for it. I'm getting really annoyed that I can't find these videos on YouTube, because the YouTube video, whenever you Google, coronavirus, vaccines, 5G, Freemasons, all you get is websites telling you that this is all hoaxes. So I think that the YouTube deserve and Google deserve a bit of a compliment for having tweaked their algorithms to make it really quite hard to find the fake news, even if you're sincerely trying to find it.
At least there are some good news. So Jakub, please go ahead.
What Western organizations are doing a good job. As I follow mostly the information field, I do have to give a shout out to my former colleagues from the East Stratcom. I think their reports on the Russian messaging regarding the coronavirus is excellent, and I would actually put it into contrast with what the rest of the EU is doing, and I can't say that I'm actually very much impressed. We've seen HRVP Borrell calling out China for disinformation. We haven't seen him calling out Russia for disinformation, despite the fact that it was his own team that actually has written these reports about Russia spreading disinformation. We see that the commissioners are pressing the social media, and I will get back to them a bit later. I get that, because this is what the researchers and journalists are asking for. But on the other hand, should we really be demanding that our authorities are pressing just the channels? They should actually be calling to Beijing. They should be calling to Moscow. They should be giving them ultimatums. You stop spreading disinformation in our countries, otherwise this will happen. I mean, this is the easy way out for them. They are pressing the companies that are under big pressure from the research community, from the journalists to do more. And our politicians are actually taking the easy way out. They are not confronting those who are producing the disinformation, paying for it, organizing it, inventing it, writing it. They are not doing anything against these guys. It's like if you would have a drug problem in your city, it's like sorry, I'm hearing someone else there. It's like ignoring the drug road and just going after the cars that the dealers use. That's nonsense. We have to be addressing the people who are actually making the profit out of it. What should the social media platforms do? I would give a little bit of credit to Twitter. They were taking down Brazilian and Venezuelan president for spreading coronavirus conspiracies. They took down Rudy Giuliani. This is something that we haven't seen in the past years. I think they did a little bit of progress. So I would give them credit for this. I would just be really happy to see this happening also during non-pandemic events, actually. I don't think that disinformation targeting our democratic order, democratic and liberal order is less harmful than disinformation about the virus. I think we need a little bit more of action also during the non-pandemic crises. So despite the fact that I agree that the platforms should be doing more, I think at least the Western companies are a bit trying. What do we do in the case when all these malicious actors move to platforms like WeChat, TikTok, Gap, platforms that the Western world doesn't have any control over? And China and Russia surely won't be discussing with us how to help us with these information operations. I'm not 100% sure that we should be putting all these eggs into one basket. I think social media platforms might help with like 20% of the problem, but there is still 80% of the problem to solve with someone else.
Right. Thank you, Jakub. I think there is a basically related question, which is, well, if we as Western democracies haven't really punished Russia for its hostilities during last 5 years, how do you think will we be able to do it now on China and Russia when essentially China has much more leverage over Western democracies than Russia has through economic interdependency, some technological, sometimes even ethnical groups are being misused by the Chinese regime against Western democracies. So I think this will be a crucial question because, as Jakub mentioned, we'll be talking about how to press the channels of disinformation, like social media platforms, but the penetrators, the main originators of disinformation, are actually still out there, and they are, as for example, China is getting more aggressive because they see that the West hasn't really punished Russia for this. So that's what I'm afraid we will be seeing. So is there something any of you think we should be doing more? Charles, please. I see you want to pop up.
I think, yes, I think we should be doing more. You know, as Jakub said, we've seen Twitter actually banning the Twitter accounts of some of the Chinese disinformation proponents, and that's been a positive thing. I do think that when this is over, according to what our Canadian Prime Minister has said, there will be some statements about China's misinformation that's come out. And I do think that the Chinese government, I think, still wants to be seen as a respected force in the global community. And if, you know, sunshine being the best disinfectant, if in fact the facts of the matter are endorsed by authoritative democratic governments, that will have a chilling effect on China and could impact on China domestically, because the Chinese people are being given the impression that their government is a respected rising force that represents the Chinese regime in a way which will allow China to recover from the humiliations inflicted upon it by Western imperialism. So they want China to be a respected nation in the world that other countries are prepared to to comply with. And so I think that this is coming. I think there's a general change in the global attitude towards the Chinese regime's lack of compliance with diplomatic and trade regimes, and that there will be increasing pressure on China, such as we haven't really made before, to actually comply with their commitments to the WTO and to respond to Western concerns about China's support for rogue regimes in the third world and other behaviors which are clearly in violation of the norms of the international community. So I think something good could come out of all of this. Of course, the best thing that could come out of it would be the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party in China, but that may be a step too far to hope for.
Right. I also have a follow-up question for Edward, if I may. One of our viewers is asking whether Edward can unpack a bit further on how you see Russian disinformation efforts, which you mentioned to be a supporting operation. So I guess supportive operation of disinformation for kinetic, like military action, which we see happening in Italy, for example. If you could develop further, please.
Yes, thanks very much. So I try to make a list of all the different tactics that Russia uses, and I got to 20. And in fact, I think if you Google Toxic 20, you'll find them. And only one of those is information. You have the use of what I call lawfare, the use and abuse of the legal system. You have overt financial flows, building economic power. You have covert financial flows, which is kind of dirty money. You have the diplomatic divide and rule games. You have subversion, the use of alienated social groups in particular. So there's a long list of different things. And you don't get all of these used at once, but it's very rare that you just have one of them. So if, for example, take Nord Stream 2, which I would regard a gas pipeline, which I would say is basically an influence operation. It's a way of creating an economic bridgehead in Germany, where you then have a company which will have lots of money, which can then hire retired politicians or the nephews and nieces or children or other relatives of politicians. It's a way of generating of these sinecure jobs, which are a very traditional way of establishing influence. So it's also creating energy dependence. If you have the second pipeline built, then it becomes cheaper to buy the gas that comes through that pipeline than to buy it from other sources. It has an effect on Ukraine because Ukrainian transit is then impacted. It no longer becomes worthwhile sending gas through Ukraine, so that's bad for Ukraine. So this one pipeline, which mixed steel and concrete on the ocean floor, is in all sorts of directions. It has all sorts of different effects. And then, of course, there's an information campaign around it saying this is good for Germany. It's about security of supply, because Germans are very keen on security, take that very seriously. But if you simply looked at the information campaign, the information operation around it, you'd be missing a lot of the other elements. So my big thing is whenever you see information operations happening, which is they're often the thing you can see, because information is inherently is public. You're trying to communicate with people. You may have to do a bit of work on the attribution first of all and say, is this really a Russian op? Maybe it's a Chinese op. But then you have to think, well, okay, what's behind this? What is the actual goal? Is it simply there to distract public opinion? Well, if it's there to distract public opinion, what's it there to distract public opinion from? What are they trying to make us ignore while we focus on this thing? Now, I have one little example here, which I'll just finish on, which I saw a tweet from what looked very much like a bot account on Twitter, saying that in my local hospital, just up the road from here where I'm sitting in London, the food supplies had broken down, and that in one ward, the patients were sharing just one bread roll. That's all they had for lunch. Now, because it's my local hospital, I know people there, I was able to check that. It's complete nonsense. And this tweet came from a kind of no name. Now, I don't know, was that Russia? Was that China? Was that just some crazy hoax or whatever? But that might be the way in, where you would then say, well, if you could prove that this was being tweeted by lots of bots, which we have, we can prove they have some kind of links to Russia. Maybe they tweeted in Cyrillic earlier, now they're tweeting in English or whatever. Then you can start saying, well, that is interesting. What's Russia trying to do? They're trying to undermine confidence in the National Health Service's ability to deal with the pandemic. And then that then leads on into other things. So these little small beginnings can lead you on to quite interesting investigations about what is really going on. Or sometimes they're just random background noise, and you mustn't overinterpret them. But anyway, that's so if you're interested, just Google Toxic 20 and you'll find my list of different components of an influence operation. And I have to say, after I wrote that list, then people came back and said, you've left a lot out. So it's probably more like the dirty 30 than the toxic 20.
Thank you, Edward. And before we move on, I'm just to remind our viewers that if you want to ask questions to our panelists, go to our website, europeanvalues.net, and you will find a Slido link where you could actually ask the questions to our speakers, or you could see it on YouTube if you are seeing us through the stream. Just below the video, you could see the link to Slido. I would like to follow up with Mariam. There is a broad question, which is whether we see Russia and China competing with each other, or if they are actually coordinating or working together. So if you look into Georgia, would you say Russia and China are competing, or more or less they are actually working together?
So thank you for the question. That's actually what we see. We see China and Russia working really well together. At least the narratives that are spread using the disinformation channels, they are supporting one another. It's not only pro-Russian outlets are supporting Chinese superiority in comparison, for example, with Italy's and overall West's capabilities of dealing with the virus. And on the other hand, China is doing the same. So they are using one another in order to promote a bigger goal, to promote bigger narrative, let me put this way. Bigger narrative is that it is the authoritarian regimes, not the liberal democracies, that can effectively fight against the virus. So here I guess their interests come really closer. And in Georgia's case, it was this way, that they supported each other.
Right. Thank you, Mariam. Can I go back to Jakub? Jakub, we have been talking about how to raise costs for hostilities. So how should Western democracies, for example, punish Russia for its disinformation hostilities? Could you just give a couple of examples of what you think practically could Western democracies do towards those who create disinformation, like Russia and China? How the cost increase could be actually done, how the punishment could happen?
I think in many cases it's really just very primitive. For start, we could stop funding the Russian propaganda machine. When you have a look at the list of biggest advertisers of Russian state TV, it's Western companies. The quote ascribed to Vladimir Lenin goes, "Capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them." That's precisely what our Western companies are doing currently. They are paying for anti-Western propaganda. So I believe the first very nice step would be to stop rewarding the Russian propaganda machine. Another step could be sanctions, and we could be talking about personal sanctions as well as sanctions against organizations. Currently, there is only one person on the EU sanctions list who's a so-called journalist. It's Dmitry Kiselyov. For those who don't know him, it's something like Vladimir Putin's Joseph Goebbels. He's really an incredibly hostile person who regularly talks about exterminating Ukrainians or Georgians on his shows, and this person really has no shame. And he has his shows every Sunday. The same Sunday evening, the same channel, you would see Vladimir Solovyov, who regularly invites people who are spreading exactly these conspiracy theories about coronavirus being a US weapon meant to exterminate the Chinese. And after the show, he sits on the plane and he enjoys his villa in Italy at Lago di Como. How come that this person is not under EU sanctions? He's been doing this for the past 5 or 6 years. So we could be sanctioning these people. We could start enforcing the laws that we already have. Both Jakub and I are from Czech Republic. Here in this country, we have a law against spreading false alarm, sometimes described as you can't shout fire in a theater. So you can't call to a hospital and say there is a bomb, you have to evacuate everyone. Whenever I open these disinformation-oriented outlets, they are persuading me that my own government is trying to kill me, that they are conducting terror attacks, that they are taking away my freedom, and that the government is in some secret conspiracies with Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all the Western elites, and they are threatening my life. What is this than spreading chaos and panic? This was a piece of news that's just 2 or 3 days old. I believe in Bulgaria, one of the pro-Russian politicians was charged with spreading panic with regards to the coronavirus pandemic. How come that we are not using exactly these laws also in a bit more calm period when there is no pandemic? So we do have laws against spreading chaos, spreading panic. We have laws against defamation. We are not using them as well. Russian media are spreading that Angela Merkel is the daughter of Adolf Hitler and that European elites are stealing Russian children and forcing them to change sex. What else is this than defamation? Again, we are not using the tools that we already have. So there's actually plenty we could be doing, and I don't think that we need some new rules or new laws. We could just start using the tools that we already have in our toolkit.
Thank you, Jakub. Charles, if I may ask you the same question on China. So how do you think, ideally, Western liberal democracies should actually punish the Chinese government for spreading this massive disinformation during the pandemic, which is even worse than during the normal times, right? We don't hear you, Charles. I think you are muted. Not yet.
How's that? Okay. Canada does have a Magnitsky list. Right now, we have government officials from Sudan, Venezuela, Russia, Saudi Arabia on the list. Up to now, we don't have a single Chinese government official on the list because of the political pressure to not do that. Certainly a lot of civil society have proposed names, particularly those Chinese officials complicit in the cultural genocide of Turkic Muslims. We could be doing the same sort of outing with regard to disinformation. I think that, thinking about what Jakub was saying, the thing is the disinformation is very appealing to internet people. I mean, it's much more interesting that Angela Merkel is the daughter of Hitler than if she's the daughter of whoever Mr. Merkel was. Or in our case in Canada, there was a story, disinformation, that our Prime Minister had been previously employed as a drama teacher in a high school in British Columbia. And the reason that he left the high school was because of sexual misconduct with teenage girls. Well, that information was completely and utterly false with no basis whatsoever. But, people wanted to believe it because it seems so much more colorful than real life. So I really don't know how you can convince people on the internet to take their information from sources which stick with scientific facts and data. It really is a major issue. And certainly the censorship of the internet is of limited value and also to some extent concerning because of violation of freedom of speech. I mean, if we censor crazy stuff on the internet, maybe they'll censor European values because everyone will be pressing the disinformation button for this particular conference. So I'm really at a loss to know how to do it. In Taiwan, there's been quite a lot of work being done by the government of Taiwan to educate the population about how to distinguish real information from disinformation. I don't know how successful this has really been because, as I say, people prefer the the fake and exciting and stimulating narratives to the more boring factual narratives that you would get from reliable sources.
Right, right. I mean, Mariam, is there something you would like to add to it?
Yes, am I heard? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Generally, I of course agree with my colleagues, and I just wanted to add a few comments. Be it the disinformation related to coronavirus or other issues. Our goal, as well as the goal of our government, should not be to entirely. I mean, it will be naive to believe that we can do anything that will help all the citizens to stop believing in the disinformation or to stop them visiting the web pages that spread hoaxes and disinformation. Our goal should be to help the majority, not the help might not be the best word, but to communicate with the majority, at least to increase awareness of the majority of the population about the threats that we're facing with. I always say that if we say that disinformation is a national security threat, then this threat needs a national response as well. And here again, I don't mean the government alone. I also mean the civil society and other parts of public. But in order the whole of society approach to be put in place effectively, here definitely we will need the government. We need the parliament to be in the front of this policy.
Thank you. Before I give one question to Edward, or pose one question to Edward, I want all of you, the other speakers, to think if you want to ask questions to other speakers as well. If you want to ask among each other, because I haven't given you the real chance for doing so. So please think about it. But there is one question for Edward. Well, Edward, we have discussed what should be done, meaning there should be more costs imposed on Russian and Chinese governments for these hostilities. But we all know that it hasn't really happened, at least on Russia, over the last 5 years, because I would say lack of courage among various political elites in the West, or sometimes strategic corruption, which is very successful in some countries, coming from Russia and apparently coming from China as well. So what would you actually propose as direct action moving forward, let's say, so that how can we actually achieve more punishment for Russian and Chinese hostilities done by Western democracies? Because it's very hard to actually see it coming.
Yes, and I think, first of all, we have to be very careful to treat Russia and China differently. Russia is a regional nuisance and a important energy supplier, particularly for people who import oil and gas via pipelines. But it's in a different category and it's a nuclear superpower. But China is deeply integrated into Western economies in a way that Russia isn't. So we have to deal with this quite differently. I would say that the way we deal with Russia is a bit like driving a car looking through the rearview mirror, and we're getting quite good, or maybe less bad, at dealing with the problems that we've had in the past. But Russia has an ability to surprise us. So we didn't see Ukraine coming, we didn't see Syria coming. We were very surprised by the big military exercises in 2009 that really caught NATO with its pants down. But after these nasty shocks, we sometimes get a bit better. So we've basically fixed the military problem in the Baltic states, which was a serious problem in 2008, 2009, because we didn't have any plans or any presence there from other NATO countries. And I would say, there's still more, a bit more to do, but we've basically fixed that problem. We've got the Magnitsky sanctions now have gone from being a sort of crazy idea that Bill Browder and I were talking about 10 years ago, and people said it'll never happen. And actually now there's a sort of idea that this is something you can do, both against Russian human rights abusers and others. So we get there, but we're behind the curve. What we need to do with Russia is to be much better at seeing what's coming next, start looking through the windshield and forestalling Russian stunts before they do them. And there's a whole bunch of things we can do on that. But I'm kind of less worried now about Russia. I feel that, particularly in Britain, we've decided that security trumps prosperity as far as Russia's concerned. There's quite a lot of awareness, and we're sort of, the things are moving. I would just like to go faster. With China, I think it's very different, because we are coming to this really late, after having gone much more dramatically in the wrong direction, having really bought the idea that this is, the future is going to be partnership with the People's Republic of China. I'm not a China expert, so I'm hesitant about coming up with anything very prescriptive. But one thing that Charles has mentioned, and he may want to go into this in more detail, is that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't understand spontaneous action. They assume that everything that happens is part of a plan, because you don't really have spontaneous behavior by the Chinese state. So therefore so if you do things like twinning with Taiwanese cities, for example, or having a Tibet Solidarity Week, or doing something to highlight the plight of the Uyghurs or the Southern Mongolians, or any of these things where China is trying to establish hegemonic discourse control. The Chinese want any discussion about anything to do with China anywhere in the world to be under their control. It's a very ambitious aim. It's also very vulnerable, because if you get, as in, for example, in your home city, Jakub, in Prague, you get the mayor of Prague saying to the PRC, sorry, I don't like what you're doing, and you know what, if you carry on doing it, I'm going to take my Prague Symphony Orchestra on tour to Taiwan. This really upsets the regime in Beijing, because they can't, it doesn't compute for them what's the source of all this mysterious opposition. So I think that the first thing to do with before we get on to questions about diversifying the supply chain and potential Magnitsky sanctions and so on, is just use the freedom of action that we have in a free society to take on these new prohibitions and taboos that the regime in Beijing is trying to institute, and just challenge them. And that's something that we can do, and it immediately makes it much easier for other people to do that. Once you have one parliament inviting a Tibetan leader to come speak to the Foreign Affairs Committee, it makes it a little bit easier for everybody else to do it. So we need to really solve this collective action problem through spontaneous action, and that reduces the ability of the PRC leadership to intimidate us.
Thank you, Edward. Charles, do you want to follow up here? And if other speakers want to ask questions to each other, we have like 10 minutes to go, so I think there is a right time to ask the questions now. Charles, please.
Yes, I do have a question for Ed. I quite agree with what you said, and it's very apparent in the current crisis in Canada-China relations, which is based on the inability of the Chinese government to accept that the Canadian judicial process against Meng Wanzhou, preparatory to her extradition to the United States, cannot be overruled by a political decision. The Chinese government, I think, felt that if they exerted more and more pressure on the government of Canada by, kidnapping Canadians, or by arbitrarily banning major Canadian exports into China, that eventually we would give in, and simply the Prime Minister would simply direct the British Columbia Superior Court to put Ms. Meng on a plane back to Beijing. I think they still don't understand our system, and the fact that the government, the leaders of the government, are not in full control of a system that's based on a separation of powers between the judiciary, executive, and legislative branches. Anyway, following on the Huawei theme, I'm wondering, Ed, if you could give us some information about whether or not the current crisis of coronavirus and other factors is impacting on the British government's consideration of the Boris Johnson decision or proposal to give Huawei 5G some limited access to the British telecommunication system.
Edward, please.
Yes. So I think that the Chinese behavior during this crisis has validated the concerns of China hawks. and I published a magazine called Standpoint, or at least I used to, and we had a piece in there by Charles Parton, who's a very distinguished British former government China watcher, who said China has a strategy for dealing with Britain, but Britain doesn't have a strategy for dealing with China. And I think that's now increasingly on the minds of our policymakers, that we realize we've gone in the wrong direction, and the people who used to sort of preach that Huawei was just absolutely fine are quite quiet these days. And there was a briefing that came out from Downing Street that after this is over, we need to have a reckoning with China. Now, I'm worried that that is sort of bombastic, slightly shallow talk, because we have, if we try and deal with China properly, it's going to be difficult, expensive, risky. It'll require some very hard choices. So it's not like changing our policy towards Brazil, where you could just decide, we don't like Bolsonaro and we'll no longer buy Brazilian meat, and basically nobody would mind. So I think the government may underestimate the difficulties. But on Huawei, I tried to organize among conservative backbenchers some pressure on the government, and we had a revolt just before the pandemic broke, which cut the government's majority quite substantially, and many more MPs who didn't want to vote against the government communicated their dissatisfaction to the conservative whips. So I think, and the government is now saying that the Huawei involvement is not just going to be constrained at a certain share of the network, but it's also going to be, they're promising a taper, that it'll be only for a limited period. So I would say we've got some movement there, but we need to keep up the pressure. The other thing one more point I'd make is that Clive Hamilton, who many of you will know for his excellent alarm bell book, Silent Invasion, about Chinese pressure on Canada, has come out with a new book called Hidden Hand, now coming out on May the 7th, written together with Marika Olberg, who many of us will know, the Berlin-based China watcher. And that's about Chinese influence operations in Britain. And although it's heavily embargoed or no one's leaking anything from it, I think it's going to be a really uncomfortable read for the kind of panda-hugging people who are pro-Huawei, pro-PRC. And I just hope that the pandemic has abated a bit by then, to the point that people will buy this book and read it.
Thank you, Edward. Jakub?
I have a question for everyone on the panel, and actually including you, Jakub, the moderator, because I know that you have been following it as well. From what I have seen, and now, just like Edward, I am no China expert, so I'm not following it that closely every day. But from what I have seen, every humanitarian aid, which is basically China selling masks and respirators to the other nations, every single case I have seen, the receiving government had to wait on the airport and participate in this propaganda show that, the whole government is waiting for the Chinese aid. When the Americans sent their tests for the virus or the potential cure, we had this remdesivir here in Czech Republic, which might be helpful with the virus. There was no minister waiting on the airport. But whenever it's the Chinese plane with the masks, you have to have half of the government waiting at the airport and saying thank you in front of the cameras to the Chinese representatives. Do we know, maybe Charles would know, is it some kind of demand? We will send you the help, but you have to participate in our propaganda shows?
I could just briefly answer. In Prague, this exactly has been the demand by the Chinese ambassador to Prague towards the Czech government. And apparently some parts of the government, Czech Prime Minister and Czech Vice Prime Minister, they both agreed to take part in this propaganda show, actually. So actually it did happen in Prague. There were very ugly pictures in Czech media of this happening as well. So, but that's just happening in the Czech Republic. I'm not really sure about other countries. So Charles, if you want to comment on that.
Yes, we have a situation now, which is that Canada ordered a lot of personal protective equipment for frontline medical workers from China. And before the order's been fulfilled, the Chinese government has, in response to the concerns in Holland and other countries that, these masks are substandard and and the test kits, many of them are not working, has decided to not export the materials to Canada because they're not from officially approved suppliers. So yesterday, our Minister of Foreign Affairs had a discussion with Wang Yi to try and pressure the Chinese government to fulfill its commitment to the provision of this personal protective equipment, which was desperately needed here in Canada. The Canadian government, I think, recognizing this issue of over-reliance on China in the supply chain for medicines and other medical equipment, has been encouraging, well, in fact, directing Canadian companies to start producing respirators and masks and gowns and so on. Canadian companies that previously produced undergarments are now making surgical gowns. Companies that made pillows are now making surgical masks, but this will not meet the demand. And so the Chinese government's decision could result in considerable loss of life in Canada if we don't get what we need. And so from that point of view, I think the Chinese government does have significant leverage. In other words, we could have a situation similar to that in the Czech Republic, where the Chinese embassy will essentially say, unless your cabinet ministers and so on are not lined up on the tarmac when the flight arrives and allow our ambassador to make a propaganda speech, we're not going to give you what you want. So it is a very difficult situation, and I think it's really going to cause the global community to rethink the over-reliance on China and India for critical supplies, and also, reevaluate the failings of past governments to keep in enough stocks of emergency supplies against disaster, because we thought it couldn't happen again.
Right. There is room for one last question. So who wants to ask it?
Maybe I will ask again a question on China. I mean, we've heard very nice comments on how we can fight back against Chinese or Russian. But Edward and Charles, if you could comment on the following question: can countries like Georgia, or Czech Republic, even if they want to fight against Chinese and Russian influences, can they do anything really effective without those great powers standing behind them? And here, of course, the United States, maybe Canada, and European Union, of course.
Well, can I go first? I have to apologise. I have to jump off this call because I've got another one coming up in a moment. So first of all, I think obviously it's difficult for the bigger you are, the easier it is. But I do think that there is room for collective action even among small countries, and the Baltic states have shown willingness to stand up on these issues. If you are, I think you're not part of 17+1, but the 17+1 countries that are in the 17+1 can downgrade their involvement in it, and we can push. I would love to see Georgia as part of the 3 Seas initiative. You're on one of the 3 Seas, which is the Black Sea. The other ones are the Adriatic and the Baltic. So I would like to see the 3 Seas initiative to expand to include all our allies around all the seas, and then really push hard for proper connectivity and infrastructure projects with transparency and Western financing rather than these murky ones. And I always think that Georgians just symbolically can do things. There's nothing stopping Tbilisi saying we want to twin with Taipei. That would infuriate the Chinese, and it's not the Georgian government's problem if the municipality in Georgia wants to do it. And you could do other things as well.
Right. Thank you very much. And Edward, if you need to run, thanks for being with us, and see you next time.
Bye, Edward.
And the very last answer from Charles, please.
Well, I think that certainly the liberal West needs to recognize that we have to be allying with all the countries of the world, not just the usual suspects, to try and counter the Chinese threat. And certainly I think that we have to be more concerned about Chinese manipulation of the Belt and Road Initiative in countries like your own to fulfill their overall plans. So I'm confident that we're going to see much more involvement of countries that have experience in dealing with China and Russia in their most extreme and manipulative form. So I'm really optimistic that we'll be gathering together like-minded countries to try and come up with a common approach to address this crisis, which really threatens the whole basis of the international rules-based order and democracy throughout the world. So we need to ally all the forces that we can ally.
Okay. Thank you very much, Charles. Mariam, Jakub, thanks very much for being with us. I think we spent good 90 minutes discussing this. We'll see how many people turned in, but I hope that it was a very informative discussion. So we will definitely keep talking to you guys again in a couple of weeks once there are new things to discuss as well. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.